All right, mate, students, this is the second part, or part B of chapter 11. And this is where we left off talking about the range of the Asian or Indian elephant, where it was and where we can essentially find it today and how it's being diminished. Okay, so next part of species stresses of trying to survive, and that would be invasive species, new species coming into an area either accidentally or on purpose, and it causes problems for those native species having to compete either directly, maybe being hunted, or maybe the new species comes in, doesn't hunt them directly, but eats all the food or changes the ecosystem in some way that causes problems to those native species. Not all species that have been brought over that it turns out bad. Many of the plants that we now consider to be part of our ecosystems, as apple trees and all that kind of stuff, right, were actually brought over, and so it's not like automatically will a species, when a plant or animal, be bad, but we have to recognize that when a new species is brought over, it's really unknown what the effect is going to be. It can be really bad potentially, and so often what it comes down to is often we're not willing to take the chance, and generally prevention is the best, we say, and so often we don't want to bring in new species for that reason. Okay, for example, what you're looking at here, well, first let me read this, right? Many non-native species provide us with food, medicine, and other benefits, so we can derive lots of good stuff from these non-native. However, a few, right? But a few can wipe out native species, disrupt ecosystems, and cause large economic losses. Now, if you're from the South, you would know what this vine is. But because we're up here, if you haven't been, you wouldn't know that this is kudzu. Kudzu, also known as the vine that swallowed the South, right? Now, this was a plant that was brought over intentionally, with the hopes that it was going to do good things. Now, here's where a little bit of information can sometimes get you into problems, right? First of all, we know that soil erosion can be a problem. And we also know that plants, when they're growing, they help anchor that soil in place and help prevent erosion. So what some people thought is, hey, this kudzu vine grows pretty good. Why don't we bring it over and it'll help, stop erosion? The problem is this thing grows so fast that it just overtakes native species and even buildings, like you can see there. It'll grow up trees and basically shade them out, and then the tree dies and the whole thing comes down, and then all you see essentially is a monoculture of kudzu, right? So that's one example of that. So here are some examples of species that have been brought over intentionally, right? We did this on purpose. For example, the purple loosestrife, the European starling was brought over. This was by one person who loved Shakespeare and thought, I want to bring all the birds that Shakespeare talked about over to the United States. And now the European starling is just running rampant, and is a problem for native species, right? The African honeybee, or the killer bees, as they're also known, again, more of a problem in the South, nutria, and so forth. You can look at that, right? So we brought these over on purpose, thinking that they were maybe going to be a good thing or be beautiful or whatever, and it turned out to be a problem. Here are some examples of species that were brought over unintentionally. The sea lamprey, the fire ant. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been bit by a fire ant? And if you have, and I don't even know, right? I'll make a guess. You were probably in the South, maybe in Florida, and you were standing in an area and you didn't quite pay attention. All of a sudden you felt your leg on fire. And that's a typical story with fire ants. Again, brought over unintentionally. This is also why we want to be protective of things that are being shipped in or brought in, because sometimes there are stowaways. Zebra mussels are a good example of those. And if you are on the water here, you've probably heard of those and maybe have stepped on them, and you realize also why they can be a problem too. Okay. So another problem is the emerald ash borer. Now notice the size of this thing, right? So there's a knuckle. So it's actually very small, okay? And it's emerald green in color. And it goes after ash trees. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Like if I were to ask you to go outside and point out to me an ash tree, could you? And maybe you could, maybe you couldn't, but these insects, they know ash trees. And if you can take a look here, one of the signs that maybe this emerald ash borer has gone into your ash tree is this little mark right here. People say it looks like a capital D on its side, right? And what it does is it burrows into just on the inside of the bark, and then it goes around like this. You can see kind of the markings right here, right on the screen. It goes around like this, and it's eating. And what it's doing is it's breaking these tubes that are carrying, nutrients up and down through the plant. And so, of course, as it's cutting those, then of course the plant dies. But you don't know it, meaning like all of a sudden you might, because it's covered in bark and you don't know what's going on in the inside of the bark because maybe you didn't see this little hole or something, right? So anyway, it's doing this thing on the inside. Eventually you start to notice the leaves start to fall off the trees and eventually it dies and then the bark falls off. And what you see on the inside are these, markings where it's just been going back and forth, right? So this was, accidentally brought over. And it has decimated ash trees. And let me share this example with you. All right, so we can see in this story here, this is a news article in the Free Press, right, where the search is on for survivor ash trees. Now, just what the article is talking about is that the emerald ash borer is decimating the ash trees in the United States, right? But there might be a few, right, as we read here, right, in the wild that have been able to withstand the emerald ash borer. And so they're trying to find them to try to understand the mechanism. Very likely, maybe they had a genetic mutation that allowed them to survive, somehow some sort of natural defense against it. And so they are actually looking for these survivor trees, right, in northwestern Ohio and southeast Michigan. You can see here, it has killed 50 million ash trees in the upper Midwest. This is not the only type of thing, that has come through and affect plants. The Dutch elm disease went through our nation and killed most of our elm trees. So when we're talking about invasive species, they affect not just animals, but it can also be plants as well. All right. Again, another invasive species that if you are on the water here that you probably have heard about or felt, right, with your feet if you actually stepped on those, and those are the zebra mussels. Now notice that this is an invasive species. Zebra mussels were first discovered in 1988 in Lake St. Clair, a small lake between Lake Erie and Lake Huron, right? They're free swimming, nearly invisible larvae may have been discharged from the ballast water of one or more ships that have come across the Atlantic, right? On the one hand, how great it is that we can have global commerce and trade from one part of the world to the next. One thing, though, that goes along with that, as you can imagine, is the ability for these hitchhikers, right? That can come through, and in this case, it was in the ballast water, and that's how we think it got over here. Like in the past, right? Without us, it'd be very difficult for these species to swim from one continent to the next, or even one country, swim across the ocean, or to fly. We make it easy with ships and planes and all that kind of stuff, right? We can see an adult female zebra mussel can produce 30 to 1,000 to 100,000 eggs each year, and they can grow on things, which then cause problems to, water pipes. They can get clogged with that. You can step on them. They can cut your feet. And of course, they're competing with native species also. But also pointing out, so keep in mind that the lakes around here that have been here for so long, it wasn't until the 1990s did they start to come out here, right? Prior to that, no zebra mussels. Now that we have them, how do you get rid of them? And the question is, like to you, is if you know how, let us know, because we don't know. And that's the big lesson with these invasive species. Prevention is the key, because so often is once they're in, getting them out is a big problem. All right, again, the Argentina fire ant was introduced to Mobile, Alabama in 1932, probably again from ships, and generally no natural predators, right? These things are tough, and they can come in and they can take over the native ant populations. And one of the benefits, I guess, of our winters here is that we're able to keep some species like this from actually migrating. They can't tolerate the cold. Now, this also, let's tie this into global climate change that we'll talk more about later, but this concept that as places warm, they now are also susceptible to different insects and maybe certain diseases that they had some protection with because of wintertime, you know, like fire ants and killer bees. We don't have to worry about those right now because they can't stand the cold, right? But if things were to change, things were warm, then we would expect it potentially to expand more to the north, you know, things like that. Okay. So again, prevention is the best way to reduce threats from invasive species, because once they arrive, it's almost impossible to slow the spread. So what can we do? I always like this first one. Do not allow wild animals to escape. Like that seems like obvious, like they needed to say this, but sometimes good intentioned homeowners do things that they shouldn't do, right? Let's say they bought a snake when it was really little and like, oh, this is so cute, I love it, whatever. And then it grows really big and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this thing. And so they release it out into the wild, right? Let it be wild, let it be free. And so right now, like for example, we have a thriving Burmese python population down in the Florida Everglades. Big Burmese pythons, right? And, you know, possibly from people releasing it to possibly, you know, hurricanes that could have caused problems, which then allowed them to escape, all that kind of stuff. So, but generally speaking, don't let wild animals escape. Don't spread wild plants to other areas. Again, maybe someone travels and says, wow, wouldn't this type of plant be beautiful where I am, but they don't understand how it will impact the ecosystem where they bring it to, right? So often there is a push to try to plant with native plants, right? Don't dump the contents of an aquarium into waterways, wetlands, storm drains. When camping, it's very important. Please don't bring, you know, firewood from where you live to a distant location. Why? Because of course you may be the person that brings, right, the emerald ash borer into a new county or new area, let's say, that didn't have it before. You know, so it's best if you're going to have a campfire, is to, you know, either buy the wood or get it from a source that's up there. Things like that, okay? And let me share with you this, I think it's about a 9-minute video that really does a great job of kind of brings in everything that we've talked about as far as invasive species, and does a really good job with it. Okay, here we go.
Meet the king of the Illinois River. Wow. And a big show-off.
Muscular.
Very muscular.
I mean, this thing will hurt you.
Yes, yes. They can jump out of the water at high speeds. They can jump a great distance out of the water, up to 8 feet out of the water.
Fast, easy to startle, and voracious eaters, Asian silver carp are a jarring sight here, and a hit on YouTube. But Greg Sass, until recently with the Illinois Natural History Survey, says that in the long history of this waterway, what's also remarkable is when this fish got here, just 20 years ago.
By the mid-2000s, it was becoming a crisis, not only with fish jumping everywhere, but just what was showing up in our catches, the amount of Asian carp versus the native fishes.
Just amazing how wide it is.
With no natural predators in this stretch of the river in central Illinois, up to 9 out of 10 fish here are now Asian carp.
We've seen explosive population growth. We've seen a population that has doubled almost every year since 2000 here. We're fairly confident we have the highest wild densities of Asian carp anywhere in the world.
Which is quite a feat considering this fish is from China. The Illinois River has been invaded.
These fish are behaving in a way that we're not used to. They're doing things to the ecosystem that we're not completely sure what kind of effect there's going to be yet. And there's just an incredible abundance of them.
It's an invasion from coast to coast, from Africanized killer honeybees in the Southwest to South American nutria in Louisiana, to the spread of the Burmese python in the Florida Everglades, all part of a scary trend.
Everywhere we look, we see species that are spreading and damaging our natural ecosystems now. And when scientists look into the future, they see the potential for many more damaging species.
You make it sound like we're under attack everywhere.
We are under attack everywhere.
David Lodge is a biologist at the University of Notre Dame. He says our agricultural system depends on plant and animal species imported to America, like wheat and cows and pigs. But that doesn't make them invaders.
An invasive species is a species that's been transported from one part of the planet to the other by people, and a species that has a harmful impact.
And typically transported by design, by accident, a little bit of both.
Both. Lots of invasive species have been transported by accident in the ballast water of ships or as a hidden pest on plants that have been imported. But many have also been imported intentionally.
Like the Shakespeare fan who, back in the 1890s, set out to bring to America every bird mentioned in the Bard's plays.
I think we can be grateful that he was unsuccessful for a great many of those birds, but he was amazingly successful with starlings.
And how did that work out?
I mean, starlings are now one of the most common birds in North America and a nuisance.
Today, they number more than 200 million. Most species were introduced for practical reasons, like the Asian carp, which was imported to clean catfish ponds in Arkansas.
But, as is almost always the case, they escaped. And it wasn't really until perhaps the 1980s that biologists in the Mississippi Basin realized this was a growing problem that was likely to get very severe.
Asian carp migrated up the Mississippi River to its tributaries, the Missouri and Illinois. Today, only a series of electric barriers in Chicago's shipping channels separate the fish from the Great Lakes and its $7 billion commercial and recreational fishing industry. Now consider kudzu, nicknamed the vine that ate the South.
Absolutely. As you can see, it's taken over the vegetation that was here. It's overtopping the small trees. It's overtopping the taller trees, and it will eventually shade them out. The trees will die, and it'll all come down to the ground, and everything that's here will be kudzu. There won't be anything living in here except for kudzu.
Back in the 30s, the U.S. government paid farmers to plant this Japanese vine to control erosion.
And the kudzu began to exemplify the theory of unintended consequences very well. It got everywhere that it wasn't supposed to get.
John Taylor of the U.S. Forest Service says kudzu, which can grow as fast as a foot a day, now covers up to 8 million acres of the South, snapping power lines and blanketing trees and even structures like this barn in rural Georgia.
And it will eventually cover the whole building. Look at this. And pull it down. And you're getting kudzu bugs all over everybody.
Itself an invasive species, popularly known in this region as the stink bug.
These little fellows like to overwinter in dwellings, and they create quite a furor when people are not used to having hundreds of thousands of these little critters invade their house. And when they're disturbed, their defensive response is a very offensive odor. So you might go sweep them out, but you'll get a surprise in the process.
Taylor says scientists do know how to eradicate kudzu.
The problem is spending the money that it would take to control large areas and the time that it would take over multiple years to control kudzu. It's not a feasible activity.
The bill would run into the billions, which brings us to the national tab for invasive species. Notre Dame's David Lodge.
The costs to the U.S. economy from invasive species generally are on the order of at least $120 billion annually.
Costs like the $10 billion that cities will spend over the next 10 years to treat or replace the millions of ash trees caught in the path of the emerald ash borer,
a bug that likely found its way from China on wooden shipping pallets. Or the tens of millions of dollars spent clearing pipes and harbors covered in trillions of zebra and quagga mussels, brought to the Great Lakes on ships from Europe. As the world grows more interconnected, Lodge says the problem will only grow worse.
There's just more opportunity now to move species intentionally and unintentionally around the globe.
Few parts of the country have more experience with that than South Florida.
You got a lot of trade, a lot of international tourism, a lot of international cargo, and you have a climate where whatever gets here lives forever.
Adam Putnam is Florida's agriculture commissioner. He says that in recent years, his state has endured infestations that range from the exotic, like Burmese pythons and Gambian pouched rats, to vital threats to agriculture, like the Mediterranean fruit fly. On his radar now, the giant African land snail, which can lay 1,200 eggs a year.
It was like a dream or something. It was like a mythic creature that walked across. It was about that big.
And they're really slithery and juicy, and they have all kinds of fluids coming out.
I don't like it. For me, it's disgusting.
With something like snails, we've got the trifecta. It carries human meningitis, so people are concerned. It eats 500 different plants, so agriculture is concerned. And it eats houses, so homeowners are very concerned.
This stucco-eating pest that can grow up to 8 inches long has brought together a team of 70 people, including representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Nationally, 30 federal agencies are involved in the fight against invasive species, with about $1.5 billion spent annually. Federal or state, funding is a struggle.
It's difficult. Screenings at the airport and seaport face other pressures to look for drugs, to look for bombs, to look for other weapons of mass destruction. So post 9/11, you see less of a focus on snails and citrus canker and laurel wilt disease and things like that.
Unsuspecting travelers bringing pests and diseases daily.
One solution for Florida, educating the public.
Wherever you're coming from, leave all that stuff behind, because any one of those things can carry the larva that's going to become the fly that's going to wipe out a $100 billion industry in our state.
Prevention is key, David Lodge argues, but also our biggest challenge.
For the most part, in the United States, we continue to operate under what I would describe as an open door policy. With very few exceptions, it is legal to import alive into the United States almost any plant or animal that exists on the planet. And there are at least 1.7 million species on the planet.
So when it comes to invasive species, as we say in the reporting business, this is a story with legs.
All right, so like I said, a nice review of so many of the concepts that surround the problems with invasive species. So, all right, next, population growth, pollution, and climate change, right? Population growth, affluenza, not influenza, right? Affluenza is sort of a play on words, this concept, right? Influenza is a deadly disease that can be caught. Affluenza is this, we'll say, a disease of the addiction of stuff, of wanting to be affluent. I need more, that kind of stuff, right? So we can go through our resources more quickly, and we want more stuff coming from everywhere, right? Or wherever it comes from. So that and pollution have promoted the premature extinction of species. Projected climate change threatens a number of species also with premature extinction. All right, pollution. Unintended, right? Each year, pesticides kill about 1/5 of the U.S. honeybee colonies, 67 million birds, up to 14 million fish, and threaten 1/5 of the U.S. endangered and threatened species. And just as a quick reminder, right, how we can see biomagnification of, fat-soluble, persistent toxins. It can start off at low concentrations, but when it stays inside of one thing and then something else eats that, now it's transferred to the thing that ate it. But the thing is, this thing doesn't just eat one. So you could imagine if there's just one part in this, if this eats 10 of these things, now this has 10 parts in it, right? And let's say something bigger comes along and eats one of those. Now all 10 parts are in its tissue, but it doesn't need to eat one, it eats 10. So 10, 20, 30, right now it's at 100. And so you can see it's biologically magnifying, right? It's accumulating inside the individual and magnifying as it goes up the food chain. Okay, so that the top predators, it could be loaded. And again, the DDT example, that's why these birds of prey that were eating fish, you know, their populations plummeted because the DDT just was at such high levels that it affected the shells of their eggs. For a similar reason why the recommendation is for women that are pregnant to not eat more than 1 serving of tuna a week, because you know, tuna is actually a large fish. And so those that are on the top of the food chain, right, are more susceptible to having these toxins build up in their bodies. You know, what a sad picture. So rhinos, this fantastic, amazing animal, right? They are often killed for their horns. See, and that's the thing, right? It's one thing potentially if starving people were using the meat and all that kind of stuff, but very often they will kill it. And why kill it? Because the rhino won't just let you take its horn, right? So they kill it just for the horn. And they sell it on the black market for, it's hard to, for decorative purposes and medicinal purposes. So first, remember I said going back to you know, stop one, stop them all. We can often look at the person who is doing the killing and say that they are solely responsible for this. But you also have to remember that if someone didn't want this, they didn't want the horn hanging out up or on their shelf as a trophy of some kind, then there would not be the desire there. Or for this medicinal purpose. There is no medicinal purpose in the horn, but the myth of it, right? And people are often will play a part in that and maybe sometimes take advantage of people. Hey, you know, you want to be a manly man, you know, here's some of this rhino, you know, take this and this will make you a more manly man or whatever. Or, hey, cure for cancer, you're desperate, here, try this, it's been used forever, that kind of stuff, right? I'll give you sort of a personal story. I remember when I was really young, elementary school, all the rage at the time was what they called a lucky rabbit's foot, okay? And as a kid, I remember watching one because all my friends had one, right? And finally the day came, I had a lucky rabbit's foot. And I can still remember feeling, I could feel the nails, right? And I thought, ooh, that's kind of weird, right? But I had my lucky rabbit's foot. And it probably took me about 5 minutes to realize, like, I was tricked. First of all, like, there's no luck in having a rabbit's foot. But the thing to remember, though, is it was in the best interest of the person selling it that this myth continued, right? And guess what? We're going to sell these to kids because, hey, they'll fall for it. They'll believe it, you know? Essentially, if someone will pay for it, then there's going to be a market for it, you know? And there are people that are more than happy to take advantage of people who are desperate or ignorant. Again, for me, at the time, being a young child and lucky rabbit's foot, right, I fell for it. But we can see that this goes on in cultures too, you know, especially when people are desperate. Again, someone has cancer or something, and they'll try anything. If someone tells them this might, you know, cure the cancer, and they can charge a lot of money for it. So remember, we have to, you know, really take on the science and understand, you know, what is real medicine, what isn't, and also this idea of decorative purposes. Again, when we can flip that to someone's repulsed to say, you know what, you got a rhino here, like rhino horn, why would you want that? That's disgusting. Don't you know that an animal had to be killed for that, so you could have that over your desk just for your decoration purposes, and let the rest of the animal just, you know, rot essentially. And especially if it was an endangered animal too, you know, sort of like being willing to take out the last of this species in a long line of evolution, right, for decorative purposes. All right, so what are some strategies that can be taken to try to help protect these species? Well, a couple of different things, right? So first of all, you have international treaties, and that's an agreement between countries And then of course you have laws within a country. Now, why do we need the two? Remember, a country is only essentially allowed to govern itself. And we all, I think, agree that we like that, meaning, we have laws in the United States that apply to our citizens. Canada can make its own laws. And if we have different laws than Canada, a police officer from Canada cannot come into the United States and arrest someone for doing something that's legal in the United States. Why? Because Canada doesn't make the laws of the world, right? In other words, the country's allowed to govern itself. The same thing though, the United States can govern itself and does not have the right to make laws for other countries. So that's where the international treaties come in. It's an agreement between countries. And in this case, as it pertains to endangered species, we have what's called CITES, not cities, it's called CITES. That's how we what CITES? The Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. And again, this is a good piece of legislation to remember come AP exam time, my test time, right? So it's very common they might ask about certain pieces of legislation, and this might be one, that can be used in lots of different scenarios. But anyway, so it makes it illegal, right, between these different countries, illegal to commercially trade, sell, all that kind of stuff. If we do want to move endangered species between countries, a very strict protocol needs to be met, meaning and followed. Let's say there's a zoo in the United States that wants a new exhibit to sort of expand awareness, and they want to bring in an endangered animal also to help protect it. They can't just call up and say, hey, ship it over, right? We got to make sure that it's being, the proper channels are being followed and the proper procedures. Why? Because, who knows if the person that you're talking to really is that zoo? It's not just an illegal trader person or something like that, someone from the black market. So that is CITES, right? It's an international agreement, treaty. Okay. Now, if we compare that to what is the law of the land in the United States, and that would be the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA, which you might see it, shortened down to. It's one of the world's most far-reaching and controversial environmental laws, but again, this applies to the United States, right? It forbids the Endangered Species Act, federal agencies, besides the Defense Department, to carry out fund projects that would jeopardize endangered species, and it makes it illegal for Americans to engage in commerce or any kind of hunting, killing, collecting, trading, anything like that, endangered or threatened species. Okay, so that's the Endangered Species Act, and it applies to everyone in the United States. Now, because of scarcity of inspectors, probably no more than 1/10 of the illegal wildlife trade in the United States is discovered. Now, remember, there's two parts if you're really trying to make a difference, right, to this. Number one, okay, you can make policy, but you also have to be willing to fund the enforcement of that, okay? Because it's easy to make policy necessarily, but if you're not having funding, then this has limited effectiveness. And I'll give you a good example of this, right? In other words, let's say you say it's illegal to, buy, sell, trade endangered species, but you don't fund any inspectors, you're not investigating, then it's more likely to be not discovered. Another example might be, for example, let's say on the expressway, if you made the law, hey, you can't drive more than 70 miles an hour. So that's the law, but we're not going to fund any police, let's just say, or maybe one police officer to watch over all the roads in Michigan. A lot of people would say, wait a minute, if there's only the odds of getting caught if someone's speeding is pretty low if you just have one police officer. And so, you might get more people not complying. And so again, the two parts of this, if you're going to make a law, make sure you're also funding it to enforce it. All right, so another way to protect wild species would be the sanctuary approach. All right, the U.S. has set aside 544 federal wild refugees as wildlife, but still many are suffering from environmental degradation also. Another way to try to protect species and maintain their genetics is what are called gene banks or seed vaults. And here, let me share the story with you here. All right, so this is in a deep mountain on a remote island, right, where it's very cold, is a seed vault. And it's a long-term seed storage facility built to stand the test of times and disaster and natural or man-made disaster. And they're basically collecting seeds from around the world and storing them in this very cold place. Okay, purposely picked as cold. So even in case the power goes off, right, they'll still be cold in the permafrost to protect these, right? In case something happens, climate change, natural disaster, human-caused disaster, essentially we have these genes for these crops, food crops, right, that we can then pull out again if we ever need to, So that would be, again, you can kind of look through this on your own if you wanted to learn more about it. But so that would be one potential way that we can see that people are trying to protect species. All right, another way, botanical gardens, that you're growing these species. So you're also kind of protecting them because you're purposely growing them and using farms to raise threatened species, of course. But these options, of course, can lack funding and storage space. Zoos and aquariums can be a great source of help protecting endangered species and also educating people, because often that's the problem. I think once people know better, they do better. Okay, like, man, I don't need the rhino horn, I don't need that ivory, that sort of stuff, right? And so, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that people are aware of the amazing species that we have. And sometimes zoos and aquariums can be just that thing, But we also have to remember that we're kidding ourselves if we think that is the solution in its entirety, right? We want these wild species where they're supposed to be, in the wild, doing their thing. We don't just want to say, hey, we've got a few species left, hey, and they're in zoos, so it's fine. We want them out in their natural environment. Okay. Reconciliation ecology involves finding ways to share the places we dominate with other species, right? Making sure that, and changing how we think about things. And, things that we grow up learning, we just think it's normal. And here's a question for you, like, why do you have a monoculture, like a beautiful front lawn or back lawn of Kentucky bluegrass? And I get it looks beautiful, but here's a question for you. Like, how many people you think back in the, 1800s and 1400s and 1200s spent the time worrying about cutting a nice, beautiful lawn? And you can imagine not many, right? Maybe the super wealthy would, but other than that, people had other things to do, or they had farms. And frankly, the thought was, if I'm going to grow a crop and water it and fertilize it, I want something I can eat or I can sell, but we've sort of really changed this now. And so now it's just kind of, when you grow up with it, it's normal. It seems normal, but historically, it's kind of an abnormal thing that we're doing. And so let me share this one quick story, replacing monoculture grasses with native species. All right, in this story, we see Minnesota will pay homeowners to make their lawns bee friendly. All right. Homeowners in Minnesota can benefit financially if they forego the grass, instead grow a lawn for bees. All right. So they have money set aside to pay homeowners to replace traditional lawns with bee-friendly wildflowers, clover, and native grasses. All right. It's part of a larger effort to help the state's declining bee population. Although the wildflowers and native grasses will benefit all species of bees, the hope is that a unmanicured lawn will specifically attract and help the rusty patch bumblebee and other ones, right, that have suffered a steep decline. So again, but I think the bigger idea is just to sort of recognize that we are all part of this cultural norm of how we grow up, what seems normal, right? And sometimes if we can, sort of step back, look at our lives with fresh eyes and question, why do we do certain things? And maybe, is there a better way? All right, so this is just one example. Let me share another one with you. All right, so this quick video I'm going to show you here, it's about someone who seems sort of abnormal in our today's world, but yet, of course, this was very normal back in the day. Everyone had farms and that kind of stuff. But in this particular case, here's someone's going to take this land and he's going to grow, I only eat food that I grew or foraged for an entire year, right? And let's kind of see what he has to say. What's his story? And again, the bigger idea, though, is that, like, what can we change the way that we, look at our lawns and grow our own food?
For 1 year, I only ate foods that I grew and foraged. 1 year without grocery stores or restaurants, nothing packaged or processed, nothing shipped long distances. Literally everything that I ate for the entire year came from my garden or that I harvested from nature. My name is Rob Greenfield. I'm an environmental activist who embarks on extreme adventures to bring attention to important environmental and social issues. Basically, I believe that our current global industrial food system is broken. Everywhere you look, it's causing severe destruction to people, to other species, and to the earth as a whole. And so I wanted to do something extreme. I've always had the question, would it be possible to step away from big ag, step away from the global industrial food system? And could I exist without grocery stores and restaurants and actually grow all my own food? I couldn't find people that had done it. So for me, the solution was to do it myself and see if it was possible. When I started, I didn't know how much sun does a carrot need? How much water do you put on your collards or your Swiss chard? I was just literally on the internet researching every plant and how to do it. Food didn't get bland because I ate over 300 species of food. I grew over 100 different foods and I foraged over 200 different foods. So that's almost a new species for every day of the entire year. I made my own flour by dehydrating cassava and yam. Then I could make my own tortillas and bread. I fermented a lot of foods and made things like sauerkraut and honey wine, ginger beer. I ate dozens and dozens of different meals throughout the year that were really varied. So it really didn't get boring. I chose Florida because as someone who had minimal experience, I did want to be somewhere where I could grow food year round. It can be done in colder climates, but I wanted to choose an easier place since I was just a beginner. And what I chose to do was not live on a farm, not live out in the countryside, because I wanted to impact people. I wanted people to see me growing my food. I wanted to interact with the community. When I arrived in Florida, one of the first things that I did is I connected with the local food growing movement. I went to the community garden. So I just really immersed in the community and got to know people. And I asked people in the community if they would like to have free food growing right in their yard rather than just grass. And the people lined up to have me turn their yard into a garden. And so I ended up having 6 front yard gardens and they were available for anyone to eat from. Quickly, it went from grass to having really enough food for dozens or even hundreds of people to eat from. And they were basically community gardens. Anybody could walk in and eat the food. For the year, I lived in a tiny house that I built out of 99% secondhand materials. It's 10 feet by 10 feet, so very small. My arm span is 6 feet, so I span across most of it. Basically, it was a bed, a desk with a chair, a freezer to store food, a couple of shelves to store a lot of food, and then under the bed, there was storage as well. Being in Florida, I was able to utilize outside as well. So my kitchen was an outdoor kitchen, and that was powered by rainwater. So my sink was just rainwater for washing dishes and hands. And I also had an outdoor compost toilet where I would compost my poop and pee and turn that into fertile soil rather than wasting water and shipping it off to be someone else's problem. That fertilizer is used on fruit trees. So not on your kale and stuff on the ground, but on fruit trees where the fruit is high above. And then lastly, I had an outdoor shower as well. And the water from that was harvested from rain. and then the water would be used to water banana plants to grow bananas. I gave myself 6 months to prepare, but that ended up being 10 months before I actually started it. And I started from scratch. I had to get seeds and soil and figure out the absolute basics. My basic strategy was to plant way more than I would need, so that way I would have enough. So that meant more work, but it ensured the success. I talked to the local gardeners and farmers, and I asked what grows so ridiculously well that even if you barely know what you're doing, it's not just going to survive, but it's actually going to thrive. I asked what has the fewest pests, what produces a huge amount of food, and what can handle neglect. And that is what I planted. And most of these were foods that I had never eaten before. You don't see at the grocery store. And a lot of them I didn't even know the name of. Things like chaya or moringa or katuk. There were dozens of plants that became my staple foods that are staples for people around the world, but that were pretty much unknown to me and most of the people I was around. A year is a pretty long time. I mean, imagine taking any sort of diet and doing it for an entire year. Through the year, I had my ups and downs. At times felt my absolute best, and then there was times that I was worried about my health. One of the most interesting times was just at the very beginning. It was just about a week and a half in, and I realized that my digestion was the best that I had felt it in my adult life. By the middle of the year, I found that I had a deficiency, I thought, in fat and protein. That's one of the hardest things to really get. For me, this is really funny because I was plant-based fully for 2 years and I didn't eat any meat. I was trying to grow plant-based protein. I was growing beans and peas that did really well, but I was trying to grow peanuts and sunflowers. And I was really excited to make my own peanut butter, literally from soil to the jar of peanut butter. I was so excited for it. But the problem was the squirrels wanted my peanuts and they wanted my sunflowers. And I grew, I put a lot of energy into it, and I barely ate just a few because they would eat them long before they were even ready for me to eat them. So in permaculture, there's a saying, and that's turn your problem into your solution. The squirrels were my problem. They were eating my plant-based form of protein. So I ate the squirrels. In doing so, I got protein that I needed, and I took care of something that was causing me a hard time in my garden. I definitely had some controversy over that in the neighborhood, but for me, it's not about black and white. We look at our food on our plates, and because it's a grocery store or because it's a restaurant, we just trust it. We don't think about where it came from, the impact that it had on other people, other species, and on the land. You can look at what I'm doing is you see it direct. You see, I ate a squirrel. But if you are getting food from a farm, even if it's vegan food, there's a good chance they're killing squirrels or rats or mice that are eating the food. So for me, I'm in the direct fire. You see these things that I'm doing, but the reality is that we're all doing this, we just don't see it. And so it makes it a very different thing. When you immerse in your food, you start to understand the reality of the dinners that we're eating. And then also, I was in Wisconsin at that time on a trip for the summer. I went fishing and I caught fish, and particularly lake trout, which are one of the fattier fishes that are out there. And I actually ate literally the entire trout, even the head, the eyes, the brain, because that's where so much of the fat is. Also, deer that were hit by cars. So some people would call that roadkill. I call them deer that were killed by cars. So that was basically between the fish and the deer. That was what brought me back into balance and gave my body the nourishment that I wasn't getting otherwise. By the end of the project, I did a body fat composition and I had 15% body fat, so I was able to work my way back up. And at the end of the year, I felt honestly better than I had recalled in my adult life. I was healthier and I was happier, and I didn't get sick once throughout the entire year. And the ironic thing is I have a little bit of a cold right now after this and getting back into the food system. My experience was that this created some of the happiest and healthiest days of my life so far. So my goal wasn't just to grow and forage all of my own food. My goal was to help other people do so as well. So during the year, I started Gardens for Single Moms, and we built gardens for 5 single-parent families in the neighborhoods and helped them grow their own food. And we planted over 200 fruit trees that were publicly accessible for everyone to eat from. And then Free Seed Project, and we sent out 5,000 garden starter kits to people to grow their own healthy food across the country. A tomato is good on a plate when you get it at the restaurant or the grocery store, but to plant that from seed, to watch it grow, to see it be this little green ball that you can eat, and then bigger, and then this ripe, juicy, plump tomato, and then to pick that and to have picked off the insects to the point where you can actually get to eat it because the insects didn't. And you went through all of those times together with that tomato. And then you get to eat that tomato. It might not actually taste better, but it tastes better. There's just that love that went into it, and you feel it, and you're like, this is the best tomato I've ever had. Most of the food that we buy at the grocery store today is shipped long distances, often from halfway around the world, if not halfway across the country. It's packaged in plastic that will be around for hundreds of years, either in the landfill or in our oceans and our lakes and our forests. It's processed and filled with ingredients that aren't really good for us, ingredients that we can't name that aren't real food. And it uses a ton of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that run off and pollute our water. So this food, although it appears harmless on our plates, has so many repercussions to people, to other species, and to the world that we depend on for our existence. And that's why I think it's important to know that. And if that doesn't match your value system, to find food that doesn't cause that destruction to the world that we live on.
All right. So some things to think about, right? At the very least, to always throughout our entire lives, be willing to step back and kind of look at ourselves objectively and say, why are we doing the things that we're doing? And those things that make sense, keep doing them. And if something doesn't make sense, to say, you know what, maybe I should do differently. Not saying that you have to grow and have all your food that you grow and find and so forth. But why not grow a garden, right? Why not? I know a former student of mine, he is really big into, he actually went to college and studied horticulture and agriculture. And now his business is trying to help people to get more of edible landscapes. Again, if we're going to be growing something, why not something that maybe is beautiful, but also you can eat? And like he said, if you've never grown your own food, and if you have grown it, you know what I'm talking about. There is absolutely something, like he was saying, let's say you want a salad or something, and you go out to the garden that you've been growing, and you pick the leaves, the lettuce leaves, and you pick the tomatoes, and you pick the cucumber, right? And you cut it up, all that kind of stuff, and you eat it right then. I don't know if it's just a psychological thing because you saw, in other words, this was just in the garden just 5 minutes ago, but now you're eating it. It's super fresh. But at the same time, there is more than that, right? Why does that tomato that you grew at your house taste better than one at the supermarket? Because you picked it at its peak ripeness, right? You pick it, ooh, look how red that is. It's perfect, ready to go. Remember, the ones at the supermarkets, very often they're picked while they're green. Why? Because, and before they're ripe and before the sugars have been developed. Why? Because if you pick a tomato at peak ripeness in Southern California, and then it needs to survive the shipping process and trucking and getting to Kroger, where they then have to put it on the shelves and it waits there for a couple of days before you pick it, it's going to be spoiled, right? And so there is a reason why the food tastes better that you grow. All right. And plus it's very rewarding. And remember, everyone had a garden or a farm or something like that. Back in the day, and that was part of it, And it's more unusual that we've kind of stopped doing that, and we just go to our grocery stores and just get our food from there. All right, other things you do, right? Maintaining habitats for insect-eating bats. Bats are amazing, right? Reduction and elimination of pesticides to protect non-target organisms, right? Like vital insect pollinators. Okay. Last thing I'll share with you, right, is this quick preview for a movie called Queen of the Sun, if you're interested in this. Now my first thought is, if I ask, what do you think of bees? Now, if you're like many people, you might say, oh no, I don't like bees, or I'm afraid of bees. And the question is, well, why? Maybe when I was really young, I got stung. Now, first of all, you have to remember, when you are a child and something happens to you, like a bee sting, it probably seemed like the worst thing in the world. And we're stuck with that memory that the reality is now, as you're older, if you were to get stung by a bee, it hurts, but it's not that big a deal. And bees generally, especially like honeybees, they don't want to sting you. Now, it's not to say, if you're allergic to bees, that kind of stuff, of course you need to take precaution. And I'm not talking about wasps, like hanging around, stuff like that, okay? But bees are an amazing species that we owe so much to, because again, they do what they do, which is collecting pollen, but in that process, they fertilize and pollinate our crops, so then we have the next generation, the fruits that come from that, and the seeds. So if you want to, once often people learn more about it, they're fascinated by bees and they go on to maybe beekeeping or anything like that. So let me just share this quick preview. And if you ever want to watch more about it, of course, then you can do that. So.
The relationship of bees and flowers is one of the most beautiful co-evolutionary relationships we have. Bees are the legs of plants.
Beekeepers, they are chosen by bees. You can brush by mustache. And they like.
If bees left this world, I wouldn't like it because there would be no honey, and no fruit.
Colony collapse disorder is the bill we are getting for all we have done to the bees.
If we didn't have bees to pollinate our crops, we'd have to eat just bread and oatmeal, all the time, and a couple of nuts.
If bees are dying, birds will be dying, plants will be dying.
We could call it colony collapse disorder of the human being, too. Steiner's prediction has come true.
So many of the problems we face come down to one thing, and that is monoculture.
The bees can't even live there. They'll starve to death.
From the point of view of nature, it's insane.
We've bred a race of super mites with every new chemical we throw at them.
Pesticides came from warfare, and of course they instantly kill the pollinators.
When you see an airplane spraying, there's this tremendous feeling of not being able to do anything. I really don't want to lose them.
I'm really finding out why I'm beekeeping is to keep that going for my children's children.
Our very lives depend on beekeeping. The bees sort of let me know, go ahead, we'll help you. Honeybee sanctuaries are springing up like mushrooms in this country.
And they're coming closer. Only in the Bronx, baby. Where are you going to find a swarm?
You see the little antennae? It's lovely. Oh, look at this. Dripping with honey. People say that they can't keep bees. They're lying.
All right, so bees are fascinating, and I think like most people, the more you learn about them, the more fascinating it is. And who knows, maybe now again, it depends on where you live, but if your subdivision or your area allows it, this might be something that potentially you're interested in too, right? Remember, there's lots of different ways we can get involved or things that we're interested in. Maybe this doesn't interest you, but again, maybe it's something. Maybe there's a whole new world out there that. For example, I know there's this one guy, he has a business called Bees in the D, and he goes in Detroit, right? Buildings, they let him, I'm not sure they let him, they rent out some of the roofs of these buildings where he keeps bees. And not only then can, of course, you make honey from that and other things, but it's also great for the ecosystem too, So, all right, we're going to stop it here. That's the end of the chapter 11 lecture notes.